Now, Build One South Africa leader Mmusi Maimane says there's a need to improve the quality of education in the country. He says better education can ensure that young people are employable. He was addressing the Cape Town Press Club earlier. In other news, is a global recession looming? Well, United Nations economists seem to think that's where we are headed. According to a new report, global economic growth is expected to shrink this year compared to 2022. That's due to several factors, including the war in Ukraine, surging inflation, the climate crisis, and debt tightening. Let's find out now what we can expect here in South Africa and on the rest of the African continent. Economist Biniza joining me now via Zoom. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your time. Not a good economic prospect, according to the United Nations, for the rest of the world. How will Africa fare? Please unmute your mic, Siatuma.
My bad. Yes, so not a good prospect at all, Dan. Fortunately, Africa is projected to have slightly better than the world economic growth in terms of its expected performance. However, one must always remember that given the small size of African economies, these economies are starting at a much lower base. So the projections for this year is that Africa at a continental level should be growing at 4.1% compared to 1.9% in terms of the global growth figure for this year, with Southern Africa, though, performing the weakest amongst the different African regions between North, East, Central, and West and Southern Africa.
What is SADC looking like?
So the projections for SADC for this year are 2.3%. South Africa is projected to be much less than that. I think South Africa at around 1.4 to 1.6%, and the remaining SADC countries are expected to keep up the SADC region afloat. Predominantly the faster growing economies such as Tanzania and to some extent Angola and Mozambique are expected to keep SADC afloat this year.
What would drive the African average growth of 4.1%, which is above the global expected, the forecast global average of 1.9%? What are the factors that would enable Africa to be sitting at that 4.1%?
Sure. So two of the key driving forces seem to be, one is still the regional integration process. And if you're looking at the different regions, the East African region is expected to grow the strongest amongst the African region at 5.1%. This is also one of the most innovative and progressive regions in terms of the regional integration process that's taking place in East Africa. The second driver seems to be the rebound in commodity prices. A lot of African countries still rely heavily on exporting raw minerals such as oil and other raw mineral commodities, which are expected to remain relatively high this year, despite having dipped at the end of last year following their peak at around mid last year due to the Russia-Ukraine conflict and sanctions against Russia. So it's those two things, the regional integration process on the continent, but at the same time the commodities also seem to be saving African economies at this point.
Yeah, I mean, East Africa seems to be leading in every other way, the likes of Kenya. Rwanda will be part of that as well, eh, Siadum?
Yes, definitely. I think the benefits of this region is that it's able to balance off uncertainties in the global economy. So African economies are currently struggling due to a number of reasons, some of the key being low demand from the traditional markets such as Europe and North America, but also more recently China as well. And the East African region, because of its integration and the focus on the domestic economy, is able to balance the slower global growth with prospects of domestic growth. And I think this is what is enabling the region to remain resilient despite relatively small economies that, one might look and think these are economies that rely heavily on tourism. How are they still able to maintain relatively high growth rates and insulate themselves? And the main key ingredient, I think, is the progress towards regional integration, which makes this region very resilient.
Yeah, they seem to be getting right. SADC, where are we lagging?
So one of the key, I would say, risks in SADC is the issue of public debt challenges. So, public debt and economic crisis have rocked Zimbabwe for, I think, over close to, if not over 2 decades now. More recently, we've seen, I think, in 2016, when Mozambique was having their debt crisis, they're slightly recovering from that now because of the natural gas exports. But more recently, we've seen that Zambia has had its own public debt crisis. And I think another part of the SADC story, apart from the debt crisis facing a lot of countries, is this issue of the slow growth in the South African economy. Historically, South Africa has accounted for about half of SADC GDP. At this point in time, we've decreased to about 40 to 45% of the SADC GDP. And it's also the slow growth in our domestic economy that is affecting the broader region. However, there are still countries that are still charting growth in terms of the region, such as Tanzania, as I mentioned earlier, Mozambique more recently, and I think Angola still seem to be prospects of growth in these regions. However, the SADC region is facing severe challenges due to fiscal public debt crisis, as well as the slow economic growth in one of the largest economies in the region, being South Africa.
And the key factor behind that currently would be the energy crisis?
Definitely, I think that plays a huge role in terms of economic growth, not only in the SADC region, but Africa more broadly. African economies have constantly been trying to industrialize, and one of the key constraints holding us back in order for us to be able to beneficiate the minerals and the commodities domestically and export final products is this issue around the energy crisis. Now, there are multiple factors that affect African countries in this. One of the primary issues being our limited access to capital. So because African countries don't have huge capital markets, they're unable to borrow from private capital markets in order to fund public investment in energy, and as a result have to rely on international development partners or other forms of concessional funding because of their limited access to global capital markets.
Yeah, we are largely an export kind of driven economy. As you said earlier, besides commodities, we export all kinds of things. But infrastructure is seemingly becoming a headache. I mean, Transnet currently cannot carry enough on its railway network. It needs to be fixed, as we've heard, and railways could assist us. But currently, we see more and more trucks on the road, and they are also targeted.
Yes, definitely. And I think this also is linked to the issue I've been raising around the limited access to capital markets. So because infrastructure is hugely large scale and you're talking large sums of money, the key driving force in capital or infrastructure investment has been the governments on the African continent. However, because governments have got limited resources, they've also and limited access to capital markets, the African governments haven't been able to carry the full load of the investments required. I think if you might remember, the Africa Investment Forum projected last year, if not the year before that, the expectation or the need for capital investment in infrastructure in Africa exceeds $100 billion per year. And of that, we're able to really mobilize very little of that. I think less than a fifth of that in terms of capital investments through at least the infrastructure investment forums have been able to be capitalized. And so again, there's a huge deficit in need for capital investments, but African countries with their limited access to capital markets and limited financial and developmental support have had significant challenges with investing in this. But it is promising that some countries are able to provide access to African countries in terms of capital support, such as China, for example, who has allocated $10 billion of its own IMF SDR allocation towards African countries in order to help them deal with some of the liquidity challenges that they're facing at the moment.
Yeah, and we're going to get deeper and deeper into debt, Seatuma Biniza. As we conclude, very briefly, how would you characterize, therefore, the outlook for Africa's economic prospects in 2023?
Sure. There's a lot of uncertainty, but I think if African countries can focus on their domestic regional integration and serving the domestic markets, we can insulate ourselves from the global economy. Fortunately, our markets aren't very integrated to the global economy, so whatever global recession hits will not affect us as severely as it will affect the rest of the world.